Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. 2021 was a pretty good reading year for me, and today I want to talk about the few books that made the strongest impression on me throughout the year. They're not strictly ranked, but very loosely I would say I'm gonna start from the ones that are a little bit lower in the scale up to my absolute top 3 favorite for the years. I have full reviews for most of these, so I'm gonna link these down below if you want to know more about any of these. Let's get started. The first one I'm going to mention is Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. If you're a fantasy fan, you're probably quite familiar with the First Law trilogy already. If you're not and you're intrigued by grimdark, for instance, and you're into character-driven stories, First Law is definitely a good entry point. I think could be a good entry point for a lot of people. Last Argument of Kings is actually the last book in the trilogy, but it was probably my favorite. The characters are definitely still as memorable as in the rest of the trilogy, but it was a good compromise between character work and plot. And also the ending, which I know is somewhat controversial, is really what made the book stand out for me, because it was really not tropey like a lot of fantasy stories can be. It was a very unique ending, which I know lovers of more traditional narratives might find a bit unsatisfying, but for me it was really unique and really clever in its nihilistic perspective somewhat. I'm not going to say anymore because I don't want to spoil anything, but that's why this book made this best of the year list. Moving on to science fiction story, and that's The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu. This is the middle book in the Three Body Problem trilogy, and while I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the first book, I really felt that Cixin Liu stepped up the quality of the story in books 2 and 3. This is one that I would recommend with some caveats and caution, because this might not be everybody's cup of tea, because the character work is not always that great in my opinion, but where the story really shines is in the exploration of a lot of these scientific concepts that you have to be prepared a little bit to think about to really follow what's happening in the story. And also in the exploration of a lot of themes and concepts that can easily be applied to our own world, our own real society. When it comes to game theory or politics or religions, deterrence, and so on, there's really a lot of these that get explored in a way that is never banal or superficial. So if you're a fan of hard sci-fi, it's definitely a must-read in my opinion. And also the fact that the author is Chinese might give a little bit of a different perspective from the usual writers that we tend to get exposed to quite often. And then I have another science fiction book, and that's The Left End of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is all set on a planet called Winter, where humans have evolved to have no gender essentially, and they can take male or female traits depending on how they feel and who their partner is. And I thought this was a perfect fusion between a more traditional science fiction story with this otherworldly feeling and vibe where you can sort of escape to, but also a very literary exploration of the theme of gender and its role in society, which can very easily be applied to our own world, or perhaps what Le Guin's world was 50 years ago. Things would have changed in the meantime, but only to some extent. So this was my first Le Guin actually, but it would definitely not be my last, because this was a really solid read for me. And then I have the book that has the lowest Goodreads rating among all the books I read last year, and that's Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. And this takes place near New York City, where a white family is renting an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere, I think on Long Island. And one evening, a black couple turns up at their door saying that something's happened in New York City, there's a general blackout, and because they actually own the house, this Airbnb that they're staying in, then essentially they ask for shelter. And then things progress from there. But this is one of those that I think a lot of people seem to consider a thriller, or seem to expect a traditional thriller, which is very much not the case, hence the low rating, I think. Because this is more of a straight literary fiction with very strong dystopian vibes in a way. I don't want to say much more than that, but it's a really compelling exploration of a lot of different themes, from the fragility of a lot of these human institutions that we rely on, but also around race and parenthood and so on. So this was a very unique and different and original book for me that I really enjoyed, but it's a bit of a polarizing one. So I would say approach with caution if it sounds like you might be interested in this one. And now we've come to my top 3 for the year, and I'm going to start from Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. This is the story of these 2 twins in their 50s who've been living with their elderly and very overly protective mother. And now they find that they have to face the external world, and we get to see their struggle in finding their place in society. And also we see how they're very reluctant in accepting help from anybody else outside the family. And this is one of those stories that follows characters at the margin of society who we don't often get to see in a relatively unusual setting as well. I found it very well written, a bit grim and quite moving, but grim and moving are probably adjectives that you can apply to all of my top 3 books, but it's definitely one that I would strongly recommend if you like these sort of stories. And then I have The Promise by Damon Galgut, and here we follow the story of a white family for about 3 decades or so. And we see that at the very start of the story, the matron of the family is about to die, and she makes her husband promise that they're going to leave one of the dwellings in this property to their black maid who's been working for them for several years. And we get to see how this promise is never really fulfilled over the subsequent years, and how the family saga runs alongside some of the key events in recent South African history. If you're interested in the history of this country, it's an absolute must read. But even if you're not, this is just an amazing book. And Galgut's writing is just outstanding. You have this feeling of kind of floating between the different characters and different places in the environment in a very effortless and masterful way. This won the Booker Prize last year, and I think it's a very worthy winner. And just for that reason, I think it's really worth reading. And then lastly, we have Our Holy Lady of Honolulu, Hanya Yanagihara, with 2 Paradise, which is quite possibly my favorite book from last year. There might be a bit of recency bias because it's one of the very last ones that I read last year, but I absolutely adored it. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. After having loved A Little Life, she could have done the same again or something very similar, and that would have been like the easiest option I would have thought for her. But I really admire that she had the courage to do something completely different. 2 Paradise is split into 3 different sections that are really 3 different novels in a way, and they take place at the end of 3 centuries, the 19th, 20th and 21st. And while A Little Life was just narrowly focusing on the stories of a small number of characters, here Yanagihara really tackles a much broader exploration of some of the themes that really impact American history and American society, from its relation with race and sexuality, and to trade-offs between human rights and civil liberties on one hand, and safety and security and public health on the other. Pandemics feature quite prominently in the second half of the book, so some people might find that unsettling. And I've already seen that this is already proving to be very polarizing, with a lot of people not getting on with it for a number of different reasons that I think are very legitimate. So again, approach with caution to see if this might be the book for you. Again, if you're expecting A Little Life 2, this is very different. But personally, I really loved how ambitious and epic in scale and scope this always felt. And also like her writing, the way it always feels so intimate, and the way she has with her characters, making them really come alive out of the page, which is so unique and so stunning, and that I think not that many writers really pull off. So for all those reasons, I was incredibly impressed, and it's really possibly, as I said, my favorite book for the year. I hope you guys like this video. Please give me a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book from 2021 was. If you want to join our Discord to talk about your favorite books or anything else with me or our community, the link is in the description box, and I'll see you the next time.